Hi everyone, welcome to Paper Town. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I want to argue that Eric Cartman is one of the most philosophically disturbing and fascinating characters in all of animation. Beyond the crude humor and shock value, Cartman embodies Machiavellianism, ethical egoism, the problem of evil, social manipulation, and the question of whether morality is anything more than a tool the powerful use to control the weak. By examining how Cartman manipulates others, how he constructs his own reality, how his relationship with his mother shapes his worldview, and how the show uses him to test the limits of moral philosophy, we can understand real philosophical questions that have troubled thinkers for centuries. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Eric Theodore Cartman presents himself as a normal kid from a small town in Colorado. But beneath the surface of this overweight, foul-mouthed fourth grader lies one of the most philosophically complex villains in television history. To understand Cartman philosophically, we need to start with what makes him a unique kind of antagonist. Not a villain driven by tragic circumstances or grand ideology, but someone who operates from a deeply coherent, deeply disturbing internal logic that challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature, morality, and what it means to be a social creature. Cartman rejects virtually every moral principle that society teaches children. He doesn't believe in fairness, kindness, empathy, sharing, or treating others with respect. He doesn't reject these values because he's failed to learn them, or because he's too young to understand them. He rejects them because he's concluded, through his own twisted but internally consistent reasoning, that these values are obstacles to getting what he wants. For Cartman, morality is not a guide to living well. It's a set of rules that other people follow, which makes them predictable and therefore exploitable. He sees moral people not as good people, but as suckers who have voluntarily limited their own options. This puts Cartman in philosophical territory that connects to some of the darkest and most challenging ideas in Western thought. He embodies what philosophers call ethical egoism, the position that the right action is always the one that best serves your own self-interest. But Cartman takes ethical egoism further than most philosophers would, combining it with a natural talent for manipulation, a complete absence of guilt, and a willingness to cause suffering that makes him function as a kind of thought experiment about what happens when someone genuinely operates without moral constraints in a social environment that assumes everyone shares basic ethical commitments. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes described the natural state of humanity as a war of all against all, where life without social contracts and moral agreements would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Cartman lives as if this is the truth about reality, but he's smart enough not to say it openly. He understands that other people believe in morality, and he uses their belief as a weapon against them. He plays the victim when it serves him. He invokes rules and fairness when they benefit him. He appeals to friendship and loyalty when he needs something from others. But none of these appeals reflect genuine beliefs. They're tactical moves in a game where Cartman is the only player who understands the real rules. What makes Cartman philosophically significant, rather than just a cartoon bully, is the consistency and sophistication of his worldview. He's not randomly cruel. His cruelty follows patterns that reveal underlying assumptions about how the world works and what matters. He believes that power is the only real currency in human relationships. He believes that people who don't pursue their self-interest aggressively deserve whatever happens to them. He believes that emotional bonds are weaknesses that can be exploited. He believes that the appearance of morality is useful, but that actual morality is a handicap. These aren't random character traits. They form a coherent philosophical framework that, while morally repugnant, is internally logical and disturbingly difficult to refute on purely rational grounds. Cartman's intelligence is often underestimated by the people around him, and sometimes by viewers as well. He's not book smart in the traditional sense. He performs poorly in school and seems ignorant about many topics. But he possesses extraordinary social intelligence, the ability to read people, predict their behavior, manipulate their emotions, and construct elaborate schemes that exploit psychological vulnerabilities. This form of intelligence is arguably more practically powerful than academic knowledge. Cartman can't solve complex math problems, but he can convince an entire town to do what he wants. He can't write a good essay, but he can orchestrate events that affect hundreds of people. His intelligence is strategic rather than academic, Machiavellian rather than scholarly. The Italian political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. Cartman has internalized this principle completely. He doesn't seek genuine friendship or affection. He seeks control and advantage. When he's kind to someone, it's always in service of a larger plan. When he appears generous, he's investing in future exploitation. When he seems vulnerable, he's setting a trap. Machiavelli advised rulers to appear moral while acting according to necessity. Cartman does exactly this, maintaining a surface of normalcy, being just a kid in a small town, while operating according to principles that most people would find horrifying if they understood them fully. Cartman's physical appearance is philosophically relevant in ways the show exploits constantly. He's overweight, which in the social world of children marks him as someone who should be low status and vulnerable to mockery. And he is mocked for his weight constantly by his supposed friends, particularly Kyle. But Cartman has turned what should be a social disadvantage into part of his persona. He refuses to accept the shame that society attaches to his body. He insists he's not fat, but big-boned. He denies reality when reality is unflattering, and creates his own narrative in which he's powerful, attractive, and superior. This capacity for self-delusion is itself philosophically interesting because it raises questions about whether Cartman actually believes his own lies, or whether the lies are strategic tools he uses while being privately aware of the truth. The show South Park uses Cartman to test moral boundaries that most entertainment won't approach. Through Cartman, the show asks what happens when someone is genuinely amoral in a world of moral people. What advantage does that give them? How do moral people respond when confronted with someone who doesn't share their ethical framework? Can morality defend itself against someone who exploits moral commitments without sharing them? These questions are central to moral philosophy and political theory, and Cartman embodies them in a way that's simultaneously horrifying and darkly funny. Cartman's catchphrases and verbal patterns reveal his philosophy in compressed form. "Screw you guys, I'm going home," expresses his fundamental rejection of group obligations and social bonds. When things don't go his way, he withdraws rather than compromising or negotiating. He doesn't see himself as part of a group with responsibilities to others. He sees himself as an individual who associates with others only when it benefits him. "Respect my authority" reveals his obsession with power and control. He wants others to defer to him, not because he's earned respect through virtuous behavior, but because he's claimed authority and expects compliance. The phrase parodies how real authority operates. People obey not because authority is morally justified, but because authority has the power to enforce obedience. Cartman understands this mechanism instinctively and tries to replicate it in his own small sphere of influence. But Mom and his manipulative interactions with his mother Leanne reveal the foundational relationship that shapes his entire worldview. Leanne gives Cartman whatever he wants. She never sets firm boundaries. She never holds him accountable. She enables his worst behavior through permissiveness and indulgence. This relationship has taught Cartman that the world exists to serve his desires, and that other people's role is to give him what he wants. When the world fails to operate this way, Cartman doesn't question his expectations. He escalates his demands and manipulations until reality conforms to his vision. Cartman represents what the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud might call the id unleashed, the raw, selfish, pleasure-seeking part of the psyche operating without the constraints of the ego or superego. Most people develop internal moral voices that regulate their behavior, telling them what they should and shouldn't do, regardless of what they want. Cartman appears to lack this internal regulation almost entirely. He wants what he wants, and pursues it without the internal resistance that most people experience when contemplating selfish or harmful actions. His ID operates almost unchecked, restrained only by external consequences, and even those only temporarily. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, meaning that we must make choices without being able to appeal to predetermined values or external authorities for guidance. Most people experience this freedom as anxiety and respond by adopting social norms and moral conventions that relieve them of the burden of choosing. Cartman has made a different choice. He's embraced his freedom fully and decided that his own pleasure and power are the only values worth pursuing. In a perverse way, Cartman is one of the most authentically free characters in television because he's truly chosen his own values, rather than accepting the values society handed him. The fact that his chosen values are monstrous doesn't change the philosophical significance of his freedom. Cartman's relationship with his three closest associates, Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, reveals how amorality functions within social groups. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny are not perfect moral exemplars, but they operate within recognizable ethical frameworks. They care about fairness, friendship, and doing the right thing, at least sometimes. Cartman exploits these ethical commitments constantly. He takes advantage of their loyalty. He manipulates their sense of fairness. He uses their empathy against them. The dynamic between Cartman and his friends illustrates how one amoral actor in a group of moral actors can gain disproportionate influence and advantage, a pattern that repeats throughout human history in politics, business, and social relationships. The show doesn't present Cartman as someone to admire or emulate. It presents him as a warning and a philosophical challenge. By making Cartman funny, and sometimes successful, the show forces viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about why we might find amorality entertaining, and whether Cartman's philosophical framework, as repugnant as it is, contains insights about human nature that more optimistic philosophies prefer to ignore. Cartman is a mirror held up to the darker aspects of human psychology, reflecting back things we'd rather not see about our own capacity for selfishness, manipulation, and cruelty. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's fundamental nature as a philosophical monster sets the stage for understanding how he deploys his most powerful weapon, the ability to manipulate reality itself through language, performance, and psychological exploitation. To understand Eric Cartman fully, we need to examine his most defining skill, his extraordinary ability to manipulate other people. Cartman is not physically strong, not academically gifted, and not socially popular in any conventional sense. What he possesses instead is an almost supernatural talent for reading people, identifying their psychological vulnerabilities, and exploiting those vulnerabilities to achieve his goals. This section examines how Cartman's manipulation works, what philosophical traditions it connects to, and what it reveals about the nature of social power and the fragility of moral consensus. Cartman's manipulation operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, he lies constantly and without hesitation. Lying comes as naturally to Cartman as breathing. He lies about small things and large things, about what happened and what didn't happen, about what he said and what others said, about his motivations and his feelings. But his lies aren't random or sloppy. They're carefully calibrated to the situation and the audience. He knows what each person wants to hear and constructs lies that match those desires. He knows what each person fears and constructs lies that exploit those fears. His dishonesty isn't a character flaw in the ordinary sense. It's a refined skill that he deploys with strategic precision. The philosopher Cicely Bach wrote extensively about the ethics of lying and how lies corrode social trust. Cartman demonstrates her concerns in vivid form. His constant lying creates an environment where nobody around him can be sure what's true. This uncertainty benefits Cartman because it makes others doubt their own perceptions and memories. When Cartman says something happened differently than you remember, you start to wonder if maybe you're wrong. When Cartman presents a version of events that contradicts yours, you begin to question your own certainty. This technique has a modern name, gaslighting, and Cartman is a master of it. He doesn't just lie about external facts. He lies about people's own experiences, making them doubt their own judgment and perception. Beyond simple lying, Cartman excels at emotional manipulation. He can cry on command, producing tears and sobs that appear completely genuine. He uses fake emotional displays to generate sympathy, guilt, and protectiveness in others. When he wants something from his mother, he cries and tells her she doesn't love him. When he wants to avoid punishment from authority figures, he cries and claims to be a victim of bullying or abuse. When he wants to turn a group against someone, he cries and claims that person hurt him. These emotional performances are convincing because Cartman understands how empathy works. He knows that most people have an automatic response to seeing others in distress, a desire to help, to comfort, to fix the situation. He exploits this automatic empathy response like a hacker exploiting a security vulnerability in a computer system. Empathy is a feature of normal human psychology, but Cartman treats it as a bug to be exploited. Cartman's manipulation of Kyle Broflovsky deserves special philosophical attention because it reveals how amorality targets moral conviction. Kyle is Cartman's primary antagonist within the group, the person most likely to call out Cartman's behavior and resist his schemes. Kyle has strong moral convictions. He believes in fairness, justice, and standing up for what's right. He's willing to sacrifice his own comfort to defend moral principles. These qualities make Kyle admirable, but they also make him predictable and exploitable. Cartman knows exactly how to provoke Kyle. He knows that anti-Semitic comments will enrage Kyle and cause him to lose his composure. He knows that injustice will compel Kyle to act, even when acting isn't in Kyle's best interest. He knows that Kyle's moral outrage can be triggered reliably, and that an enraged Kyle makes mistakes. Cartman uses Kyle's moral strength as a weakness, turning his virtue against him. This dynamic illustrates a disturbing philosophical problem. In a confrontation between someone with moral principles and someone without them, the person without principles often has an advantage because they have more options available to them. Kyle won't lie, cheat, or manipulate because his morality prevents it. Cartman will do all of these things because nothing prevents him. Kyle has to fight with one hand tied behind his back, constrained by his own values, while Cartman fights with every weapon available. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described something similar in his concept of master morality versus slave morality. Nietzsche argued that conventional morality was created by the weak to constrain the strong, and that truly powerful individuals operate beyond conventional moral categories. While Nietzsche's philosophy is more nuanced than this summary suggests, Cartman embodies a crude version of this idea. He treats morality as a tool, the weak use, and the strong exploit. Cartman's manipulation extends beyond individual relationships to entire communities. In numerous episodes, Cartman manages to influence the behavior of large groups of people, sometimes entire towns, or even nations. He does this through a combination of confidence, persistence, and an understanding of group psychology. He knows that people in groups behave differently than individuals. Groups are more susceptible to emotional appeals, more likely to follow confident leaders, and more prone to mob mentality. Cartman exploits these group dynamics expertly, positioning himself as a leader or victim depending on what the situation requires. The episode The Passion of the Jew from Season 8 demonstrates Cartman's ability to channel group emotions for his own purposes. After seeing Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, Cartman is inspired by what he perceives as the film's anti-Semitic message. He organizes a fan club that gradually takes on the characteristics of a political movement. Cartman dresses in clothing that deliberately evokes fascist imagery and leads his followers through the streets chanting in German. He's channeling real historical patterns of hate and demagoguery, not because he has a sophisticated political ideology, but because he intuitively understands how charismatic leadership and group emotion can be combined to create power. The episode is disturbing precisely because Cartman's methods work. People follow him. His movement grows. His manipulation of religious and cultural emotions produces real effects in the community. Cartman's manipulation also operates through what psychologists call framing. The way you present information determines how people interpret it. Cartman is a master framer. He doesn't just describe events. He constructs narratives that cast himself as the hero, victim, or authority figure as needed. When he's caused a problem, he reframes the narrative so that someone else appears responsible. When someone else has achieved something, he reframes the story to minimize their accomplishment or take credit for it. When confronted with evidence of his wrongdoing, he reframes the conversation to focus on the supposed wrongdoing of his accusers. This reframing is so constant and so skilled that people in his environment live in a perpetually distorted information landscape where truth is whatever Cartman says it is at any given moment. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote extensively about totalitarianism and political evil, described how constant lying in public life doesn't just produce misinformation. It destroys people's ability to distinguish truth from falsehood at all. When someone lies consistently enough and confidently enough, the result isn't that people believe the lies. The result is that people stop believing anything. They lose the capacity for judgment because all information sources seem equally unreliable. Cartman creates this effect in his immediate social environment. His friends know he lies constantly, but they've been so saturated with his lies that they sometimes can't determine what's true, even when the truth should be obvious. His manipulation has degraded their capacity for independent judgment. Cartman's ability to manipulate authority figures is particularly noteworthy. Children are supposed to be subject to adult authority, but Cartman routinely manipulates parents, teachers, and other adults to serve his purposes. He understands that adults want to believe certain things about children, that children are innocent, that children don't lie about serious matters, that children need protection. He exploits these assumptions by performing innocence when it benefits him. When he cries to a teacher about being bullied, the teacher's assumption that children are basically honest gives Cartman's performance credibility. When he tells a parent that another child did something wrong, the parent's protective instincts kick in before critical evaluation can occur. Cartman operates in the gap between how adults assume children behave and how he actually behaves. The manipulation of his mother Leanne is Cartman's most fundamental and most revealing form of control. Leanne is the person most susceptible to Cartman's manipulation because she wants more than anything to be a good mother and to have her son love her. Cartman exploits this desire mercilessly. When he wants something, he tells her she's the best mom in the world. When she tries to set a boundary, he tells her she doesn't love him and threatens emotional withdrawal. He's conditioned her through years of manipulation to equate giving him what he wants with being a good parent. Leanne knows on some level that she's being manipulated, but her need for Cartman's approval and her fear of his rejection overpower her judgment. This dynamic reveals how emotional dependency creates vulnerability to manipulation. The more someone needs your approval, the more power you have over them. Cartman's manipulation also relies on what game theorists call commitment problems. In game theory, a commitment problem occurs when one party can benefit from making promises they don't intend to keep. Cartman makes commitments, promises, and agreements constantly, but has no intention of honoring them. He promises to share credit, then takes it all. He promises to be fair, then cheats. He promises friendship, then betrays. Because other people operate under the assumption that agreements should be kept, they're constantly blindsided when Cartman violates agreements that he never intended to honor. His willingness to break any promise gives him a strategic advantage over people who feel bound by their word. The episode Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5 stands as the most extreme and philosophically significant example of Cartman's manipulation. We'll examine this episode in detail in a later section, but briefly, Cartman orchestrates an elaborate revenge scheme against an older boy named Scott Tenorman, who humiliated him. The scheme involves manipulating multiple people across multiple steps, culminating in an outcome so horrifying that it redefines viewers' understanding of what Cartman is capable of. The episode demonstrates that Cartman's manipulation isn't limited to petty schemes and childhood tricks. When sufficiently motivated, he's capable of planning and executing operations of shocking cruelty and complexity. Cartman's manipulation raises the question of whether he represents a realistic portrayal of how some people actually operate in the real world. The show exaggerates for comic and dramatic effect, but the underlying patterns of behavior Cartman displays, lying, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, exploitation of trust, framing, and strategic victimhood, are all documented patterns of real human behavior. People who display these patterns in clinical psychology are often described as having antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. Cartman exhibits traits associated with both conditions, though applying clinical diagnoses to a cartoon character obviously has limits. What makes Cartman's manipulation philosophically important, rather than just psychologically interesting, is that it raises questions about the social contract. Philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau argued that society functions because people agree, explicitly or implicitly, to follow certain rules and treat each other with certain minimum standards of respect and fairness. This social contract works because most people internalize the rules and follow them most of the time. But what happens when someone benefits from the social contract, lives in society, enjoys its protections and advantages, while systematically violating its rules? Cartman is a free rider on the social contract. He enjoys the benefits of living in a community where most people are honest and cooperative, which makes them easier to exploit, while never contributing to the honesty and cooperation that make those benefits possible. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's mastery of manipulation would be alarming enough on its own, but it becomes truly terrifying when we see the most extreme example of what it produces. The episode Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5 stands as one of the most important episodes in the entire series, and possibly in all of animated television. It's the episode that transforms Cartman from a bratty, manipulative child into something genuinely frightening. What happens in this episode reveals depths of calculation, cruelty, and patience in Cartman that change how we understand his character retroactively. Understanding what happens in this episode and what it means philosophically reveals how Cartman's amorality produces consequences that go beyond anything his friends or victims imagined possible. The setup for the episode is simple and almost trivial. Scott Tenorman is a 9th grader who sells Cartman his pubic hair by convincing Cartman that having pubic hair makes you mature. Cartman pays $16 for Scott's pubic hair and then discovers he's been tricked. He didn't actually need pubic hair and certainly didn't need someone else's. He's been made to look foolish, and the money is gone. For most people, this would be an embarrassing experience that you'd try to forget. You'd be annoyed at being tricked, and you'd move on. But Cartman doesn't move on. He fixates on the humiliation and the lost money with an intensity that is completely disproportionate to the offense. Cartman's first attempts at revenge are straightforward and unsuccessful. He tries various schemes to get his money back, but Scott outsmarts him every time. Scott burns the money in front of Cartman. He humiliates Cartman publicly. He makes Cartman cry. Each failed attempt and each additional humiliation doesn't discourage Cartman. Instead, it increases his determination and escalates his willingness to go to extreme lengths. This escalation is philosophically significant because it shows how Cartman processes challenges. Where most people would eventually accept defeat and move on, weighing the cost of continued conflict against the value of what was lost, Cartman's ego won't allow him to accept being beaten. The original offense was $16, but the humiliation of being outsmarted has made it personal in a way that transcends any rational calculation of costs and benefits. What happens next is the episode's shocking twist, and the moment that permanently changes Cartman's character. Cartman invites the boys and Scott to a chili cook-off. Throughout the episode, we've seen Cartman apparently making bumbling attempts to get revenge, while Scott has countered every move. At the chili cook-off, Scott reveals what he thinks is his ultimate counter-move. He's trained a pony to bite off Cartman's penis. But when the pony is revealed, nothing happens because Cartman was expecting it. He anticipated Scott's plan because he wanted Scott to think he was winning. Then, Cartman reveals what he's actually done. He told Scott's parents about a pony-killing ranch, knowing they would go there to save the pony. At the ranch, he had arranged for the farmer to shoot and kill them, thinking they were trespassers. Cartman then took Scott to Norman's dead parents, ground them into chili, and fed them to Scott at the cook-off. Scott has been eating his own parents. When Cartman reveals this, Scott breaks down completely. He vomits, screams, and cries. Cartman licks Scott's tears and savors his suffering. This moment is philosophically significant for several reasons. First, the disproportionality of the revenge. Scott tricked Cartman out of $16 and embarrassed him publicly. Cartman responded by killing Scott's parents and feeding them to him. The gap between offense and retaliation is so vast that it enters a different category of human behavior entirely. This isn't revenge in any proportional sense. It's annihilation. It's the complete destruction of another person's psychological world in response to a minor slight. This reveals that Cartman doesn't operate according to any concept of proportional justice. When he feels wronged, his response isn't calibrated to match the wrong. His response is total. Second, the planning involved reveals terrifying patience and intelligence. Cartman didn't act impulsively. He constructed an elaborate multi-step plan that required predicting multiple people's behavior, manipulating events across different locations, and maintaining the appearance of incompetence while executing a sophisticated operation. He played the fool deliberately, letting Scott think he was winning so that Scott would become overconfident and predictable. This level of strategic thinking in a child is disturbing because it suggests Cartman's intelligence, when focused by hatred and injured pride, is capable of outcomes that most adults couldn't achieve. He's not just a mean kid. He's a prodigy of cruelty. Third, the emotional satisfaction Cartman derives from Scott's suffering reveals something about his psychology that goes beyond simple revenge. He doesn't just want his money back or want Scott to stop bothering him. He wants Scott to experience maximum suffering. He licks Scott's tears. He savors the moment. He's deriving genuine pleasure from another person's total psychological destruction. This connects to what philosophers call sadism, pleasure derived from the suffering of others, but it's sadism deployed strategically as the culmination of a long-term plan rather than simple cruelty of opportunity. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the concept of ressentiment, a French term for a specific kind of resentment that involves feeling wronged, and then channeling that feeling into elaborate revenge fantasies that eventually become action. Nietzsche saw ressentiment as a psychological mechanism that could transform weak individuals into dangerous ones by giving them a focus for their energy and intelligence. Cartman embodies ressentiment perfectly. The original humiliation of being tricked by Scott to Norman becomes the organizing principle of his life for the duration of the episode. Everything he does is oriented toward revenge. All of his intelligence is channeled into this single destructive purpose. The result is an act of cruelty that exceeds anything Scott could have imagined. The episode also raises questions about moral responsibility in chains of causation. Cartman didn't personally kill Scott's parents. He arranged for a farmer to shoot them based on false information Cartman provided. The farmer thought he was defending his property. He didn't know he was participating in a murder plot. This creates moral complexity. Who is responsible? The farmer who pulled the trigger? The boy who set the whole thing in motion through manipulation? Cartman would argue, and does argue in later episodes, that he didn't kill anyone. He just arranged circumstances. But morally and legally, this is exactly what conspiracy to commit murder means: arranging for death through manipulation of others. Cartman's ability to achieve terrible outcomes while maintaining a degree of separation from the actual violence reflects how sophisticated evil operates in the real world. The most dangerous people aren't always the ones who pull triggers. They're the ones who manipulate others into pulling triggers for them. Scott Tenorman Must Die serves as Cartman's origin story in a sense, though he was already a horrible person before this episode. After this episode, viewers, the other characters, and Cartman himself all understand that he's capable of things that go beyond ordinary childhood cruelty. He's not just a bully. He's someone who can plan and execute operations of devastating cruelty with patience, intelligence, and emotional satisfaction. The episode raises the stakes for every future interaction with Cartman. If he can do this over $16, what would he do over something he cares about more? The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil after observing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi bureaucrat who helped organize the Holocaust. Arendt's insight was that Eichmann wasn't a monster in the dramatic sense. He was an ordinary person who committed monstrous acts through bureaucratic detachment and a failure to think critically about what he was doing. Cartman represents a different kind of evil, one that isn't banal at all, but is instead creative, passionate, and engaged. Cartman doesn't commit evil through thoughtlessness or detachment. He commits evil through active intelligence and genuine pleasure. He's fully engaged in his cruelty, thinking creatively about how to maximize suffering and savoring the results. This makes him more disturbing than Arendt's banal evil, because it suggests that evil can be a source of genuine satisfaction and creative expression for some people. The episode forces viewers to confront their own reactions to Cartman's revenge. Many viewers found the twist darkly funny, despite its horror. The elaborate setup, the shocking reveal, and Scott's over-the-top reaction are constructed as comedy, even though the content is horrifying. This creates an uncomfortable experience where you're laughing at something that should horrify you. The show is testing whether comedy can make anything acceptable, and whether our laughter reveals something about our own relationship to cruelty and revenge fantasies. Most people have imagined disproportionate revenge against people who have wronged them. Cartman just actually does it. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Scott Tenorman episode reveals what Cartman is capable of at his most focused. But to understand why he's like this, we need to examine the relationship that created him. Eric Cartman's relationship with his mother Leanne is the foundational relationship of his life, and the key to understanding how he became the person he is. Every aspect of Cartman's worldview, his sense of entitlement, his belief that the world should serve his desires, his inability to tolerate frustration, his manipulative behavior, can be traced back to how Leanne raised him and continues to enable him. This section examines the philosophical implications of their relationship, how permissive parenting connects to broader questions about authority, self-regulation, and the development of moral character, and what the show suggests about the origins of amorality through this mother-son dynamic. Leanne Cartman is a single mother who appears on the surface to be a kind, sweet, accommodating woman. She speaks softly, smiles frequently, and seems gentle and non-threatening. But beneath this pleasant exterior lies someone who has profoundly damaged her child through a specific kind of neglect. The neglect of not setting boundaries, not enforcing consequences, and not teaching Cartman that other people's needs and feelings matter. Leanne's failing isn't cruelty or abuse in the conventional sense. It's the absence of structure, discipline, and moral education that children need to develop into functional members of society. When Cartman demands something, whether it's food, toys, television, or anything else, Leanne gives it to him. When he throws tantrums, she capitulates. When he behaves badly toward other people, she doesn't correct him or impose consequences. When he says terrible things, she responds with gentle deflection rather than firm correction. She has essentially taught Cartman that his desires are paramount and that the world will rearrange itself to accommodate him if he pushes hard enough. This isn't intentional on Leanne's part. She's not trying to create a monster. She's a lonely woman who desperately wants her son's love and has concluded, consciously or unconsciously, that giving Cartman whatever he wants is the price of maintaining his affection. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about the education of children in his book Emile, arguing that children need to learn the natural consequences of their actions in order to develop moral sense and practical wisdom. Rousseau believed that shielding children from consequences didn't protect them, but instead made them incapable of functioning in the real world. Leanne has done exactly what Rousseau warned against. By shielding Cartman from all consequences, she's prevented him from developing the internal regulatory mechanisms that would allow him to control his impulses, consider others' feelings, and defer gratification. Cartman has never learned that he can't always get what he wants, because his mother has ensured that he always gets what he wants. This permissive parenting has produced what developmental psychologists call an external locus of control, combined with extreme narcissism. Cartman doesn't regulate his own behavior because he's never had to. External factors, other people's responses, physical consequences, social pressures, are the only things that constrain him. He has no internal moral compass because none was ever developed. A moral compass is not something children are born with. It's something that's cultivated through consistent teaching, modeling, and experience of consequences. Leanne provided none of these things, so Cartman developed without moral infrastructure. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that moral development requires treating people as ends in themselves rather than as means to our own ends. Kant's moral philosophy centers on the idea that every person has inherent dignity and should never be used merely as a tool for someone else's purposes. Leanne has failed to teach Cartman this fundamental moral principle. Instead, through her own behavior, she's taught him that people exist to serve his needs. She serves his needs constantly, modeling a relationship where one person exists to satisfy another. Cartman has generalized this model to all of his relationships. He treats everyone the way he treats his mother, as someone who should give him what he wants without resistance. The show explores Leanne's psychology in several episodes that reveal why she parents the way she does. Leanne is lonely, sexually promiscuous, and has low self-esteem. She uses sexual relationships with numerous men to try to fill an emotional void, and she uses her relationship with Cartman to provide meaning and purpose to her life. Being a mother, specifically being the kind of mother who makes her child happy, is central to Leanne's identity. If she starts setting boundaries and Cartman becomes angry with her, she loses both her son's affection and her own sense of purpose. She's trapped in a dynamic where being a good parent in the enabling sense feels necessary for her own emotional survival. In the episode Tist from Season 10, Leanne finally attempts to discipline Cartman after his behavior becomes so extreme that professional help is required. A series of nannies and behavioral experts fail to control Cartman, but eventually, a dog trainer named Cesar Millan, parodying the real television personality, successfully teaches Leanne how to establish boundaries with Cartman by treating his behavioral problems the same way you'd treat a disobedient dog. The approach works. Cartman begins to behave better when Leanne consistently enforces rules and consequences. For the first time, we see Cartman responding to structure and limitations. He's not happy about it, but he starts to adjust his behavior. But the episode ends with Leanne unable to maintain the discipline. The loneliness of being a single parent with an angry child overwhelms her, and she returns to her permissive patterns. Cartman regains control of the household, The episode demonstrates that Cartman's behavior is not inevitable or unchangeable. He could respond to consistent discipline, but maintaining that discipline requires strength that Leanne doesn't have. Her own psychological needs prevent her from doing what her child needs. She would rather have a monstrous child who seems to love her than a healthier child who is angry at her. This is a tragic failure of parenting, driven by the parent's own unresolved psychological issues. The philosophical implications of the Cartman and Leanne dynamic extend to questions about nature versus nurture, and whether people like Cartman are born or made. The show suggests it's both. Cartman may have natural tendencies towards selfishness, impulsivity, and aggression, but these tendencies were shaped and amplified by his upbringing, rather than being moderated by it. A different parent might have recognized Cartman's difficult temperament and worked harder to teach him empathy and self-control. Leanne did the opposite, reinforcing his worst tendencies by removing all obstacles to their expression. Nature provided the raw material, but nurture molded it into something genuinely dangerous. Cartman's relationship with Leanne also illustrates the philosophical concept of the tyrant in the home. Political philosophers have long recognized that tyranny begins in small-scale social units before it expands to larger ones. A person who learns to dominate within a family will seek to dominate in larger social contexts. Cartman is a domestic tyrant who has complete control over his household. His mother obeys him. She feeds him what he wants, lets him watch what he wants, and does whatever he demands. This experience of domestic tyranny has given Cartman a taste for power and a template for how relationships should work. He tries to replicate this dynamic in every social situation, seeking to dominate and control others the way he dominates and controls his mother. The episode 1% from season 15 shows Cartman's relationship with his mother reaching a breaking point when Leanne, influenced by other parents, begins trying to set limits on Cartman's behavior. Cartman responds with escalating manipulation and eventually violence, destroying his own stuffed animals and blaming mysterious attackers. The episode reveals Cartman's absolute inability to tolerate any reduction in his control over his domestic environment. When Leanne even hints at establishing boundaries, Cartman experiences it as an existential threat because his entire worldview depends on the assumption that he can control the people closest to him. If his mother can resist him, then his power isn't absolute. And if his power isn't absolute, then he's vulnerable. This vulnerability is what Cartman fears most, more than any external threat. The dynamic between Cartman and Leanne connects to broader philosophical questions about the origins of moral behavior. Are people naturally moral, requiring only minimal guidance to develop ethical behavior? Or are people naturally selfish, requiring extensive socialization to learn morality? Thomas Hobbes argued for the latter position, suggesting that without external authority and enforcement, people would behave selfishly and destructively. Cartman seems to confirm Hobbes's pessimistic view of human nature. Without effective moral education from his mother, he's developed into exactly the kind of selfish, destructive individual that Hobbes warned about. His natural tendencies, unchecked by socialization, have produced a person who treats the world as his personal resource. Alternatively, the philosopher John Locke argued that children's minds are blank slates, tabula rasa, that are shaped primarily by experience and education. From this perspective, Cartman isn't inherently evil. He's been shaped into what he is by his mother's parenting and his social environment. His cruelty, his selfishness, and his amorality are learned behaviors rather than innate traits. If Leanne had parented differently, Cartman might have become a different person. This doesn't excuse his behavior, but it contextualizes it within a framework where responsibility extends beyond the individual to the systems that shape them. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Leanne's permissive parenting created the foundation for Cartman's worldview, but that worldview finds its most dangerous expression in how Cartman understands and uses power. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the will to power describes a fundamental drive in all living things, a drive not just for survival, but for dominance, expansion, and the imposition of one's will onto the world. Nietzsche saw the will to power as a universal force operating beneath all human behavior, even in actions that appear altruistic or self-sacrificing. Eric Cartman embodies the will to power in its crudest, most naked form. He wants power. He seeks power. He structures his entire life around acquiring and maintaining power over others. This section examines how Cartman's pursuit of power connects to Nietzsche's philosophy, how his authoritarian tendencies reveal truths about the psychology of dominance, and what the show suggests about the nature of power itself. Cartman's desire for power manifests in almost every episode. He wants to be the leader of every group. He wants to make the decisions. He wants others to obey him. When he's not in charge, he works to undermine whoever is. When authority figures exercise power over him, he resents it and plots to reverse the dynamic. His catchphrase, "Respect my authority," encapsulates his fundamental orientation toward the world. He doesn't want respect based on merit or accomplishment. He wants respect based on position, on the fact that he's declared himself to be in charge, regardless of whether anyone agreed to that arrangement. Nietzsche distinguished between different expressions of the will to power. In healthy individuals, the will to power manifests as creativity, self-overcoming, and the creation of new values. In unhealthy individuals, it manifests as domination, cruelty, and the destruction of others. Cartman represents the unhealthy expression almost exclusively. He doesn't create. He controls. He doesn't build. He dominates. He doesn't develop himself. He subjugates others. His will to power is directed entirely outward, toward making others submit to his desires, rather than inward, toward becoming a more capable or excellent person. The episode Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000 from Season 4 demonstrates how Cartman uses social institutions as tools for power. When Cartman throws a rock at Token Black during a sledding competition and is charged with a hate crime, the episode explores how legal and social systems can be manipulated by someone who understands the language of victimhood and rights without genuinely caring about the principles those systems are meant to protect. Cartman doesn't understand or care about why hate crime legislation exists. He only cares about how the system affects his personal situation. He's entirely capable of deploying the language of rights and justice when it serves him, while completely disregarding those concepts when they don't. Cartman's authoritarian tendencies become explicit in the episode The Death of Eric Cartman from Season 9, where the other boys decide to ignore Cartman completely, acting as if he doesn't exist. Cartman's response to being ignored is complete psychological collapse. He believes he's actually dead because no one will acknowledge him. This reveals something crucial about his psychology. His sense of self depends entirely on his ability to affect others. Without an audience to manipulate, without people to control, Cartman doesn't know who he is. His identity is constructed entirely through his relationships to others, specifically through his power over others. Remove that power, and he ceases to exist psychologically. This connects to the philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's concept of the master-slave dialectic. Hegel argued that self-consciousness requires recognition from others. We become aware of ourselves as subjects through being recognized by other subjects. The master depends on the slave for recognition, even though the master seems to have all the power. Without the slave's recognition, the master's identity as master collapses. Cartman is the master who needs slaves to recognize him as master. When his friends withdraw recognition by ignoring him, his identity disintegrates. He's powerful only when others are present to be subjected to his power. This reveals that Cartman's power is paradoxically dependent on the people he seems to dominate. Without them, he's nothing. Cartman's relationship to authority figures throughout the series reveals a complex relationship with power that goes beyond simple desire for dominance. He respects authority when it's exercised in ways that benefit him, and despises authority when it constrains him. He doesn't have a principled position on authority. He evaluates each instance of authority based entirely on whether it serves or threatens his interests. Police officers are useful when they're protecting him, and obstacles when they're enforcing rules against him. Teachers are allies when they give him good grades, and enemies when they discipline him. Government is good when it does what he wants, and tyrannical when it does what he doesn't want. This purely instrumental view of authority is itself a philosophical position, one that treats all social structures as tools to be evaluated based on their utility to the individual. The episode Cartman Land from Season 5 shows Cartman inheriting $1 million from his grandmother and immediately buying an entire amusement park. His dream is to have the park all to himself, with no lines, no crowds, no other people. This is Cartman's vision of paradise, unlimited pleasure with no social obligations. But the reality of running a business forces him to admit other people so he can pay for maintenance and operations. Gradually, more and more people are allowed in until Cartman Land becomes a normal amusement park, and Cartman loses control of it entirely. The episode functions as a parable about the relationship between individual desire and social reality. Cartman wants to exist in a world where he has everything and owes nothing to anyone. But the practical requirements of maintaining what he has force him into social arrangements he didn't want. This mirrors philosophical arguments about why societies form in the first place. People give up some individual freedom in exchange for the benefits of collective organization, security, infrastructure, shared resources. Cartman wants the benefits without the cost, the amusement park without the other people. Reality won't allow it. Even his $1 million can't buy him freedom from social interdependence. Cartman's will to power also manifests in his need to be the center of attention. He can't tolerate situations where someone else is the focus. When a classmate achieves something noteworthy, Cartman either tries to diminish their accomplishment or claims credit for it. When a crisis occurs that doesn't involve him, he inserts himself into it. When a group activity proceeds without him as leader, he either undermines it or refuses to participate. This need for centrality is a form of power seeking because being the center of attention is a form of social dominance. The person everyone is focused on has disproportionate influence over the group's behavior and decisions. Nietzsche wrote about the Übermensch, or Overman, a being who transcends conventional morality and creates their own values through the exercise of will. Some readers of Nietzsche have interpreted the Übermensch as a justification for domination and cruelty, though this interpretation is widely contested among scholars. Cartman represents the worst possible interpretation of Nietzsche, the crude reading that treats transcending morality as license for unlimited selfishness and cruelty. Cartman has transcended conventional morality, but he hasn't replaced it with anything creative or life-affirming. He's replaced it with nothing except his own appetites and his desire to dominate. He's a parody of the Übermensch, someone who has gone beyond good and evil, but found nothing on the other side except emptiness and hunger for power. Cartman's pursuit of power is also characterized by its pettiness. He doesn't seek power over nations or worlds. He seeks power over his friends, his school, his town. He wants to win arguments with Kyle. He wants to be first in line. He wants the best seat. He wants others to acknowledge his superiority in trivial contexts. This pettiness is philosophically revealing because it shows that the will to power operates at every scale. The same psychological drives that produce dictators and tyrants also produce schoolyard bullies and office politicians. The scale differs, but the underlying mechanism is the same: the desire to impose your will on others and to be recognized as dominant. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's will to power shapes everything he does, but it finds particularly disturbing expression in how he constructs and defends his view of reality. One of Cartman's most philosophically fascinating and disturbing traits is his ability to construct and inhabit alternative versions of reality. He doesn't just lie to others about what happened. He appears to genuinely believe his own distortions, at least in the moment he's promoting them. This section examines how Cartman's relationship with truth and reality connects to philosophical questions about perception, self-deception, the social construction of reality, and whether objective truth can survive sustained assault from someone willing to deny it persistently enough. Cartman lives in a world where facts are flexible and reality is whatever he says it is. When he's clearly at fault for something, he constructs a narrative in which he's the victim. When evidence contradicts his claims, he rejects the evidence rather than adjusting his claims. When everyone around him agrees on what happened, he maintains his alternative version with such conviction that he creates doubt and confusion. This is not ordinary lying, which involves knowing the truth and deliberately stating something different. This is something closer to what the philosopher Harry Frankfurt called bullshit in his essay On Bullshit. Frankfurt distinguished between liars, who know the truth and try to conceal it, and bullshitters, who don't care about truth at all, and say whatever serves their purposes without regard for whether it's true or false. Cartman is the ultimate bullshitter. His relationship to truth is not one of opposition, but of complete indifference. Truth is irrelevant to him. What matters is what works. The episode Fish Sticks from Season 13 provides a perfect example of Cartman's reality construction. Jimmy writes a joke that becomes enormously popular nationwide. Cartman, who was present when Jimmy wrote the joke but contributed nothing, gradually constructs an alternative memory in which he was the primary creative force behind the joke. The episode shows Cartman's memory literally changing. In his mental replays of the event, he imagines himself writing the joke while Jimmy watches passively. Each time he replays the memory, his role becomes larger and Jimmy's becomes smaller until he sincerely believes that he created the joke and Jimmy was barely involved. This is philosophically significant because it demonstrates how self-deception can be total and sincere. Cartman isn't pretending to believe he wrote the joke. He's actually reconstructed his memory so that he genuinely believes his version of events. This connects to psychological research on false memories and the malleability of human recollection. Our memories are not perfect recordings of events. They're reconstructions that are influenced by our desires, our self-image, and our emotional needs. Cartman's need to see himself as creative, talented, and responsible for good things is so powerful that it overrides his actual memories and replaces them with flattering fictions. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the role of self-deception in human psychology, arguing that people constantly deceive themselves about their motivations, abilities, and importance in order to maintain a workable self-image. Most people engage in mild self-deception, overestimating their contributions, underestimating their faults, remembering events in ways that cast them favorably. Cartman takes this universal tendency to its extreme. His self-deception is so complete that it creates an alternate reality in which he is always right, always the hero, always the victim when things go wrong, and always the genius when things go well. He's a cautionary illustration of what happens when the normal human tendency towards self-serving bias is completely unchecked by self-awareness, honesty, or external correction. Cartman's construction of reality extends to his body image in ways that the show explores for both comedy and philosophical depth. He's clearly overweight, but he insists he's not fat. He's big-boned. He looks in mirrors and sees someone different from what others see. He genuinely believes he's physically imposing and attractive despite all evidence to the contrary. This is more than vanity. It's a demonstration of how strongly motivated reasoning can override direct sensory evidence. Cartman sees what he wants to see because seeing the truth would damage his self-image in ways he can't tolerate. His ego creates a filter between reality and perception that transforms incoming information to match his preferred narrative about himself. The concept of what George Orwell called doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both of them, describes Cartman's mental operations perfectly. Cartman can know on some level that he's overweight while simultaneously believing he's big-boned. He can know that he didn't write the joke while believing that he did. He can know that he's behaving cruelly while believing he's the victim. These contradictions don't create cognitive dissonance for him because he's developed the ability to compartmentalize his mind so thoroughly that contradictory beliefs coexist without conflict. This makes him unpredictable and impossible to argue with because he can shift between contradictory positions fluidly, depending on what the situation requires. Cartman's relationship with reality also involves the imposition of his reality onto others. He doesn't just construct alternative realities for himself. He attempts to make others accept his version of events as true. When he tells Kyle that something happened differently than Kyle remembers, he's not just lying. He's attempting to replace Kyle's reality with his own. When he tells the group a story that distorts what actually happened, he's trying to establish his version as the group's accepted truth. This is an exercise of power through narrative control. Whoever controls the story controls reality for practical social purposes, even if objective reality hasn't changed. Cartman understands this instinctively. He knows that social reality is whatever the group agrees it is, and that if he can get enough people to accept his version, it becomes effectively true, regardless of what actually happened. The show uses Cartman's reality construction to explore how truth functions in social groups. In episodes where Cartman promotes demonstrably false claims, the other characters' responses vary. Sometimes they push back and insist on the truth. Sometimes they're confused by his confidence and begin to doubt their own memories. Sometimes they simply give up arguing because the effort of constantly correcting Cartman's distortions is exhausting. This exhaustion effect is philosophically important. Maintaining truth against persistent, confident denial requires energy and commitment. Cartman understands that if he denies truth long enough and confidently enough, people will eventually stop arguing, not because they've been convinced, but because they've been worn down. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Cartman's ability to construct his own reality is frightening in itself, but it becomes even more significant when we examine how it connects to the show's exploration of prejudice and hatred. The town of South Park itself functions as a philosophical laboratory where the show tests moral ideas, social assumptions, and political ideologies. The town is small, isolated, and populated by adults who are frequently more foolish, selfish, and susceptible to manipulation than the children. Understanding how the show uses its setting and secondary characters to explore philosophical questions helps contextualize Cartman's behavior within a larger commentary on human nature and social organization. Cartman doesn't exist in a vacuum. He's a product of and participant in a community whose dysfunction enables and mirrors his own. The adults of South Park are, with few exceptions, failures at the moral education and social modeling that children need. Randy Marsh, Stan's father, is impulsive, narcissistic, and prone to following whatever trend or crisis captures his attention. Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's father, is sanctimonious and self-righteous, willing to pursue moral crusades that serve his ego more than any genuine ethical purpose. Stuart McCormick, Kenny's father, is neglectful and alcoholic. The principal of the school, PC principal, oscillates between performative political correctness and authoritarian overreach. Mr. Garrison, the teacher, is one of the most psychologically damaged and morally confused characters in the series. None of these adults provide reliable moral guidance to the children. This absence of competent adult authority connects to the philosopher John Stuart Mill's arguments about the importance of moral education in a functioning society. Mill argued that liberty requires educated citizens capable of making good judgments. Without proper education and moral development, people become susceptible to manipulation, mob mentality, and poor decision-making. South Park's children are growing up in exactly the kind of environment Mill warned about, surrounded by adults who can't teach them well because the adults themselves haven't learned. The town's susceptibility to mass hysteria, moral panic, and group delusion is a recurring element of the show. In various episodes, the townspeople panic over imaginary threats, embrace and abandon fads with alarming speed, and treat complex problems with absurd solutions. This collective irrationality creates the environment in which Cartman thrives. He's a manipulator operating in a community of people who are easily manipulated. His individual amorality is amplified by the community's collective stupidity and moral confusion. The philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville warned about the tyranny of the majority in democratic societies, the danger that popular opinion could become a form of coercion as oppressive as any king's decree. South Park depicts this tyranny repeatedly. When public opinion shifts in the town, individuals who dissent face social punishment, ostracism, and sometimes physical danger. Cartman understands this dynamic and exploits it. He can often achieve his goals by aligning them with whatever the town's current obsession is. If the town is worried about something, Cartman positions himself as part of the solution. If the town is angry about something, Cartman channels that anger toward his own targets. He rides waves of collective emotion the way a surfer rides waves, using the town's energy to carry him toward his own destination. The show uses the town of South Park to explore how social institutions fail to contain individuals like Cartman. The school fails to educate him effectively. The legal system fails to hold him accountable. His family fails to discipline him. Social norms fail to constrain him. Religious institutions fail to give him a moral framework. Every institution that is supposed to civilize children and prevent them from becoming dangers to society has failed with Cartman. This comprehensive institutional failure raises questions about whether our social systems are capable of handling individuals who are genuinely amoral and willing to exploit every vulnerability in the system. The show also uses South Park's isolation to create a controlled experimental environment. Because the town is small and relatively self-contained, the consequences of various philosophical experiments can be traced more clearly than in a larger, more complex setting. When Cartman implements a scheme, we can see its effects on the entire community. When a moral panic sweeps the town, we can see how it affects every character. This controlled environment allows the show to explore philosophical questions with a clarity that would be harder to achieve in a more realistic setting. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The town of South Park provides the laboratory, but the deepest experiments the show conducts concern the nature of identity itself. Who is Eric Cartman really? This question runs beneath the surface of the entire series and connects to fundamental philosophical questions about the nature of personal identity, authenticity, and whether a consistent self exists beneath the various roles and performances we present to the world. Cartman changes his persona constantly, adapting to different situations with different presentations of himself. He's a crying victim one moment and an authoritarian dictator the next. He's a caring friend when he needs something and a cruel enemy when he doesn't. This constant shifting raises the question of whether there is a real Cartman beneath all the performances, or whether the performances are all there is. The philosopher David Hume argued that the self is just a bundle of perceptions, that there is no permanent, unchanging self beneath our experiences. We feel like we have a consistent identity, but that feeling is an illusion created by the continuity of memory and habit. Cartman's character seems to support Hume's view. There's no stable core Cartman that remains consistent across situations. He adapts and changes so fluidly that trying to identify the real Cartman feels like trying to grab water. Every version of him is real in the moment it's being performed, but no version seems more fundamental than any other. Alternatively, the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued that identity isn't something we have, but something we create through our choices. We are not defined by our nature or essence, but by our actions. From this perspective, Cartman's identity is precisely the sum of his choices and actions. He is someone who consistently chooses manipulation, selfishness, cruelty, and power. These consistent choices constitute his identity, even if they're expressed differently in different contexts. The real Cartman is the pattern of choices he makes, which is consistently selfish and amoral even when the specific behaviors vary. The episode Awesome O from Season 8 explores Cartman's identity in a remarkable way. Cartman disguises himself as a robot named Awesome O to gain access to Butters' secrets, intending to use those secrets to humiliate Butters later. But as he maintains the robot disguise, something interesting happens. Butters treats Awesome O with kindness, trust, and genuine affection. He confides in the robot, shares his fears and hopes, and treats Awesome O as a real friend. Cartman, trapped in his disguise, is forced to experience being treated well by someone who has no ulterior motive. This experience doesn't fundamentally change Cartman, and he eventually betrays Butters' trust as intended. But the episode raises questions about whether Cartman might be capable of genuine connection if the circumstances were right. When someone treats him with unconditional kindness, he doesn't know how to respond because his entire social toolkit is designed for manipulation and conflict rather than genuine relationship. Cartman's elaborate fantasy, lives, and role-playing episodes also explore his identity. In episodes where Cartman plays pretend, whether as a cop, a superhero, a businessman, or any other role, he throws himself into the character completely. The line between Cartman playing a role and Cartman being that role becomes blurred. When he plays the Coon, a superhero alter ego, he seems to genuinely believe he's a hero saving the world, even though his methods are violent, self-serving, and counterproductive. These roleplay episodes suggest that Cartman uses fantasy identities to experience aspects of himself that his normal social role doesn't allow. As the Coon, he can be heroic rather than villainous, altruistic rather than selfish, admired rather than despised, at least in his own imagination. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The question of who Cartman really is connects to the show's deepest philosophical concern: whether people can genuinely change, and whether redemption is possible for someone like Cartman. Can Eric Cartman be redeemed? This question haunts the entire series and connects to some of the deepest questions in moral philosophy about human nature, free will, and the possibility of genuine transformation. Redemption implies that someone who has done terrible things can somehow become a better person, that their past doesn't have to determine their future, and that even the most damaged individuals have the capacity for positive change. Whether this is possible for someone like Cartman, someone whose entire personality seems organized around selfishness and cruelty, is one of the most challenging philosophical questions the show raises. The question of redemption connects to the philosophical debate about determinism and free will. If Cartman's behavior is determined by his genetics, his upbringing, his psychology, and his social environment, then he might not be truly free to change. He behaves the way he does because the causal forces that shaped him made this behavior inevitable. From this determinist perspective, expecting Cartman to change is like expecting a boulder to roll uphill. His character is the product of forces beyond his control, and moral transformation would require changing those forces, rather than just expecting different outputs from the same inputs. Alternatively, if Cartman has genuine free will, if he can choose differently despite his history and psychology, then his failure to change is itself a choice for which he bears full moral responsibility. Existentialist philosophers like Sartre argued that we are always free to choose, regardless of our circumstances. From this perspective, Cartman's cruelty isn't the inevitable result of his upbringing. It's a choice he makes and continues to make. He could choose kindness, empathy, and moral behavior at any moment. His refusal to do so is the most damning thing about him because it means his evil is chosen rather than imposed. The show has experimented with Cartman's potential for redemption in several episodes. In Test from Season 10, when the dog trainer's methods temporarily transform Cartman's behavior, we see that he's capable of behaving differently when consistent external pressure is applied. He follows rules. He modifies his behavior. He even seems somewhat content with the structure. But when the external pressure is removed, he reverts immediately. This suggests that Cartman's capacity for better behavior depends on external constraints rather than internal motivation. He can be good if forced to be good, but he won't be good voluntarily. In the later seasons of the show, particularly in the serialized seasons, Cartman has moments that seem to suggest genuine emotional growth. He forms what appears to be a sincere, romantic relationship. He expresses feelings that seem authentic rather than manipulative. He makes choices that serve others rather than just himself. But the show consistently undermines these apparent changes, revealing them to be temporary, illusory, or ultimately self-serving. The message seems to be that genuine redemption requires more than behavioral modification. It requires internal transformation at a level that Cartman either can't or won't achieve. Christian theology, which forms part of South Park's cultural context, teaches that redemption is possible for anyone through divine grace and genuine repentance. The show references Christianity frequently, and several episodes explore whether Cartman can access the moral framework that religion provides. In the episode Do the Handicapped Go to Hell from Season 4, the boys are confronted with religious teachings about sin and damnation. Cartman's response to these teachings is entirely self-interested. He doesn't want to go to hell, so he's willing to modify his behavior temporarily to avoid divine punishment. But this isn't genuine moral transformation. It's the same transactional thinking he applies to everything else. He's willing to follow God's rules the same way he's willing to follow any rules, only when the cost of breaking them exceeds the benefit. The Buddhist philosophical tradition offers another perspective on Cartman's potential for change. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from attachment, and that liberation comes from releasing attachment to ego, desire, and fixed identity. Cartman's entire being is organized around ego, desire, and fixed identity. He's the most attached character in the show, attached to his appetites, his self-image, and his need for control. From a Buddhist perspective, Cartman's suffering and his cruelty are both products of his extreme attachment. Releasing these attachments would liberate him from both his suffering and his harmful behavior. But Buddhist liberation requires exactly the kind of self-examination and ego dissolution that Cartman is least capable of or willing to undertake. The philosophical tradition of virtue ethics, originating with Aristotle, argues that good character is developed through practice. You become virtuous by repeatedly choosing virtuous actions until they become habitual. But this requires starting to practice virtue, which requires some initial motivation to be good. Cartman lacks this initial motivation entirely. He has no reason, internal or external, to begin practicing virtue. The virtuous cycle that Aristotle describes never gets started because the first step requires something Cartman doesn't have, a desire to be better. The show's most pessimistic statement about Cartman's capacity for redemption might be that he doesn't want to be redeemed. Redemption requires recognizing that your current way of being is wrong and wanting to change. Cartman doesn't think he's wrong. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He thinks his approach to life is more honest than the morality that constrains everyone else. He sees moral people not as people he should emulate, but as suckers he should exploit. Without the desire for change, change is impossible, regardless of whether free will exists or external conditions change. Cartman is trapped in his own worldview, a worldview that tells him he's superior, and everyone else is deluded. The question of redemption for Cartman ultimately connects to questions about human nature itself. If humans are fundamentally capable of goodness, and Cartman simply hasn't accessed that capacity yet, then redemption remains possible. If some humans lack the capacity for genuine moral development due to genetics, neurology, or early developmental damage, then Cartman might be genuinely irredeemable. The show doesn't definitively answer this question, instead maintaining the tension between hope for change and evidence of stasis. Cartman remains what he's always been: brilliant, selfish, cruel, and occasionally, painfully, almost human. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The question of Cartman's potential redemption leads naturally to the final question about what his character teaches us about our own moral lives and the nature of evil in the real world. After spending this entire video examining Eric Cartman through a philosophical lens, looking at his manipulation, his cruelty, his suffering, his relationships, and his worldview, we can step back and ask what Cartman's character reveals about real human struggles with morality, power, and the nature of evil. Cartman is a fictional character in an animated comedy, but the philosophical questions he embodies are genuine questions that apply to our actual world. Understanding what the show is saying through Cartman helps us think about our own lives and about the people we encounter who operate outside the moral frameworks most of us take for granted. The first lesson from Cartman's character is that amorality exists and that moral people need to recognize it. Most people assume that everyone around them shares basic moral commitments. We assume others have consciences, feel guilt, and are constrained by at least minimal standards of decency. Cartman demonstrates that these assumptions aren't always warranted. Some people genuinely operate without moral constraints, and they can be devastatingly effective in social environments that assume everyone is playing by the same rules. Recognizing that amoral actors exist isn't cynicism. It's realism that's necessary for protecting yourself and others. Second, Cartman shows that intelligence and morality are independent variables. Being smart doesn't make you good. Cartman's social intelligence is extraordinary, but it's deployed entirely in service of selfish and cruel objectives. This challenges the assumption, common in educational and philosophical traditions, that knowledge naturally leads to virtue. Socrates argued that no one does wrong knowingly, that evil is always a form of ignorance. Cartman refutes this. He knows what he's doing is wrong by conventional standards. He just doesn't care. His knowledge hasn't made him good. It's made him a more effective predator. This suggests that moral education requires more than just developing intellect. It requires developing empathy, conscience, and a sense of connection to others that goes beyond strategic calculation. Third, Cartman's relationship with his mother teaches us about the importance of boundaries in love. Leanne loves Cartman, but her love without boundaries has produced a monster. This isn't a condemnation of maternal love. It's a demonstration that love alone isn't sufficient for healthy development. Children need structure, consequences, and honest feedback alongside unconditional love. Love that gives everything and demands nothing teaches children that their desires are the center of the universe, which is exactly the lesson Cartman has internalized. Good parenting requires the courage to set boundaries, even when doing so means your child is temporarily unhappy with you. Fourth, Cartman shows how manipulation exploits our best qualities. His manipulation works because other people have empathy, trust, and a desire to see the good in others. These are positive traits that make social life possible, but they're also vulnerabilities that manipulators can exploit. Cartman's success in manipulating others isn't evidence that morality is foolish. It's evidence that moral people need to be wise as well as good, recognizing when their positive traits are being exploited and developing the discernment to distinguish genuine need from calculated performance. Fifth, the show uses Cartman to explore how prejudice functions as a psychological tool. Cartman's bigotry isn't based on knowledge or experience. It's based on his need for enemies, his desire for a simple worldview, and his addiction to the feeling of superiority. Understanding bigotry as a psychological mechanism rather than just a moral failure helps us address it more effectively. People don't become prejudiced because they've carefully examined evidence and reached bigoted conclusions. They become prejudiced because prejudice serves psychological needs, providing simple explanations for complex problems, offering targets for displaced anger, and creating a sense of belonging to an in-group defined against an out-group. Sixth, Cartman's suffering teaches us about the complexity of compassion. We can recognize that someone is suffering without excusing their harmful behavior. We can feel sympathy for someone's pain without accepting that pain as justification for cruelty. This is a sophisticated moral position that the show models through its treatment of Cartman. The show doesn't ask us to hate Cartman. It asks us to see him fully, as someone who causes harm and experiences harm, who is both perpetrator and victim in different contexts. This full seeing is more morally demanding than either pure condemnation or pure sympathy. It requires holding complexity and refusing easy resolutions. Seventh, the dynamic between Cartman and Kyle teaches us about the challenges of maintaining moral conviction in the face of amorality. Kyle's struggle against Cartman mirrors the struggle that moral people face in any context where they encounter those who don't share their values. It's exhausting to maintain moral principles when someone is constantly exploiting and undermining them. But the alternative, abandoning moral principles because someone is exploiting them, would make the world exactly what Cartman wants it to be. Kyle's persistence in opposing Cartman, even when it costs him, represents the necessary commitment to moral life that prevents societies from being overrun by their worst members. Eighth, Cartman's character raises questions about the limits of tolerance. How should a society deal with individuals who exploit its openness and tolerance? Liberal democracies are built on values of freedom, tolerance, and respect for individual rights. But these values create vulnerabilities that individuals like Cartman can exploit. The philosopher Karl Popper called this the paradox of tolerance. If a society is tolerant without limit, its tolerance will eventually be seized and destroyed by the intolerant. Cartman exploits South Park's tolerance and openness to advance his own intolerant, selfish agenda. The show suggests that communities need mechanisms for identifying and constraining individuals who exploit shared values without contributing to them. Ninth, the show's treatment of Cartman suggests that evil is often banal, domestic, and local rather than grand and dramatic. Cartman isn't a supervillain plotting world domination. He's a kid in a small town who wants more food, more attention, and more power over his immediate social environment. His evil operates at the scale of everyday life, in classrooms, homes, and playgrounds. This is where most evil actually occurs in the real world, not in dramatic confrontations between good and evil, but in small acts of cruelty, manipulation, and exploitation that accumulate over time and create misery for the people affected by them. 10th, Cartman teaches us about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems, process information, and achieve goals. Wisdom is the ability to know which problems are worth solving, which information matters, and which goals are worth pursuing. Cartman has intelligence without wisdom. He can achieve his goals with remarkable effectiveness, but his goals are uniformly selfish and destructive. This distinction matters because our culture often conflates intelligence with good judgment. Smart people can make terrible choices. Capable people can pursue terrible goals. Intelligence is a tool that amplifies whatever values it serves. In the service of good values, intelligence produces wonderful things. In the service of Cartman's values, intelligence produces suffering. The show also teaches through Cartman about the importance of accountability. Every system and institution in South Park has failed to hold Cartman accountable for his behavior. His mother, his school, the legal system, his peer group, all of them have failed to impose consistent consequences for his actions. This collective failure of accountability has allowed Cartman to develop unchecked. The lesson is that accountability structures matter. When institutions fail to hold people responsible for harmful behavior, those people learn that harmful behavior has no costs. Cartman has learned exactly this lesson, and he behaves accordingly. Finally, Cartman's character serves as a reminder that moral life is an ongoing struggle rather than a settled achievement. The people around Cartman have to constantly resist his influence, correct his lies, oppose his schemes, and maintain their own moral bearings in an environment that Cartman works tirelessly to corrupt. This is exhausting, and the show acknowledges that exhaustion. But it also shows that the alternative, giving up the struggle and letting Cartman's worldview prevail, is worse than the exhaustion. Moral life requires effort, vigilance, and the courage to maintain ethical commitments, even when those commitments are costly and challenging. Cartman teaches us this by showing what happens when that effort is abandoned. Eric Cartman is one of the most philosophically rich characters in the history of animation. Through his manipulation, his cruelty, his suffering, and his relationships, the show South Park explores questions about human nature, morality, power, identity, and the possibility of redemption that have occupied philosophers for thousands of years. Cartman is simultaneously funny and horrifying, relatable and alien, pathetic and dangerous. He's a character who forces us to think about things we'd rather not think about and to confront aspects of human nature that more optimistic storytelling prefers to ignore. The fact that he does all of this while being a cartoon 8-year-old from a small town in Colorado makes his philosophical significance all the more remarkable. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.